What George Bush said to justify this is that the surveillance of communications prior this time was set up in the age of the very beginning telephones, and that they needed new laws to allow surveillance of communications that were now online, now on the World Wide Web. So now they can conduct surveillance on information we release on the World Wide Web. And we can track how that was abused, that system was greatly abused. It's one thing to look at what the Patriot Act says, but it's not so much what it says, but what they used it as an excuse to do. Back down in this history, particularly in 2015, the courts began to recognise that what they had used the Patriot Act to do was unconstitutional, and they begin to prove in court cases, they begin to decide that it is now illegal. Not necessarily what it says, but what they later on used it to do. The original authors of the Patriot Act, the main author, his name is Jim Sensenbrenner, and he said over in 2013 and 14 that he never planned for the US government to use the Patriot Act in the way that they had. He authored the Patriot Act and said that they used it to violate the Constitution. We see George Bush tried to extend its powers even further, and he is blocked by two men, James Comey and Robert Mueller, the same men that are restricting Donald Trump today. These are two men that have been held very high positions as either the director of the FBI, the highest position you can have, or working within those areas, both having directed, I believe it's the FBI. And in that position, they have investigated Donald Trump for colluding with Russia, which is, as you can imagine, not acceptable to work with a foreign government to win your own election. And both have questioned him on this. When James Comey started looking into Donald Trump's work with Russia, Donald Trump immediately had him fired. Robert Mueller has taken up that work and is now conducting a very, very thorough investigation, a very secret investigation into what went on between Russia and Trump. Donald Trump releases most of his thoughts via Twitter. He sends out these little tweets on this social media platform saying what he thinks. And if you follow those tweets, a large amount of them, much of what he has to say is just takedowns of this investigation and of Robert Mueller. He's doing his very best to shut down this investigation and stop people looking into his dealings with Russia. So far he has failed, and that investigation is continuing, but he's setting up the courts in such a way that he can try and shut that investigation down. That is perhaps the most volatile, the most controversial thing happening in the United States right now is this investigation into Donald Trump's dealings with Russia, and that investigation is being led by Robert Mueller. Then we began to look at 2014. What we need to see in 2014 is a further breakdown of the Constitution. We need to see violations of conscience. What I suggested was that to understand the external, the internal is our key. And we see some interesting things happen in those years inside this movement. In 2012, a message came out of Britain to the United States. This was the message of time. This message was rejected. It has taken many years for it to be, for the evidence to be laid out and for the leadership to accept. We have had messages come into this movement that have not necessarily come from the leaders. There's been lay people who've added stones to this structure, but it's been accepted by the leaders. Now we have a message come out of Britain and to the United States that is not accepted by the leadership, and we were expected to accept it for ourselves, whether or not the leaders accepted it or not. This is when we're supposed to identify the voice of God. And as individuals, we started with the leadership and failed to identify the voice of God speaking through people who are relatively unknown. So this message faced two primary obstacles. Rejection by leaders, and also one other, internal enemies. The work of internal enemies. Those enemies are working in 2012, but they're hidden. If you talk about William Miller and his associates, it's his associates that worked against William Miller accepting the message. And those associates that also worked against the message of time show themselves in 2013 as internal enemies working against the movement. We begin to see Path of the Just, etc. But we see these men then working against the movement that they were a part of. So these are the twofold enemies. In 2014, was 2014 a waymark for us? Yes, it is our waymark. It's our Sunday law. Whether these two fought it or not, you can't stop a waymark. If God says that 2019 is Raphia, it's 2019, whether there's the work of enemies or the rejection of leaders. You don't stop a waymark by our own behaviour. So 2014 is a Sunday law. That was not a failure. It was a successful waymark. However, we personally saw that. In 2012, then, if what happens in 2012 is a further attack on the Constitution and the rights of the people, it faced a twofold enemy. One of those was the leader. This is Barack Obama. Obama was a Democrat, and it's the Democrats that at 9/11 fought against the Patriot Act. Not all of them, many of them voted for it, but it's the Republican Party that brought in the Patriot Act. George W. Bush, Republican. Obama, a Democrat. And it's the Democrats that over this time had fought against the Patriot Act, had to, not all of them, but primarily had tried to get it abolished, had tried to shut Guantanamo Bay, the secret US prison where they hold people without trial. So he was elected in 2012 based on his promises that he would restrict the Patriot Act and close Guantanamo Bay. So we see if there's going to be a further breakdown, it does not come from the leadership. But there's one other problem, and that is internal enemies. This is leaders. Not just Obama, but the Democrat Party. There's also internal enemies. And the main one we would consider is Edward Snowden, a private NSA contractor. The reason that we know the extent of what they did under the Patriot Act is due to this man. He was working privately for the NSA when he began to secretly collect from their database a massive collection, the largest collection of top secret documents in history, taken and then released. This leaking began in 2013. In June through 2014. He's still leaking through the early months of 2014. He only released 1% of the documents that he collected, and that 1% did significant damage to the United States. It showed that they were not only conducting surveillance on their citizens, but they were also conducting surveillance on foreign leaders, that they were bugging the phones of, for example, Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany. So when you're the leader of Germany and one of the closest allies of the United States, and you find out that they've put a bug on your phone and are listening to your private conversations, you can imagine that starts to strain alliances. But by releasing just 1%, these government agencies knew that he had much more information, and they lived in fear for a very long time of just what he had and just what he was going to release. They didn't know. Because of that, they're forced to be more transparent, and they're forced to change their practices. Suddenly, the American Civil Liberties Union sued the FBI and sued the NSA for their use of the Patriot Act. And internet companies began to use encryption. If you contact via WhatsApp, WhatsApp is an encrypted program, which means that it's essentially locked. Once you write a message and send it, it's locked until it reaches the sender, and then it's unlocked. If normally, before the time of Edward Snowden, messages weren't locked, they were just floating through and anyone could access them if they had the right tools and know what you had said. Now everything is encrypted, which means it's in code that is not able to be accessed by the government. And the reason that they started to put these things in code and lock them was when they recognized that the government was spying on these programs. So what Obama did in 2014, by the way, we can mark these enemies extending into 2014. That's when the split really happens. In 2014, Jim Sensenbrenner. This is the main author of the Patriot Act. He wrote it up. He said, "A large, intrusive government, however benevolent it claims to be, is not immune from the simple truth that centralized power threatens liberty. Our government's legitimacy rests on its accountability to the people, and Americans are increasingly wary that Washington is invading the privacy rights guaranteed to us by the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution." The Patriot Act was set to expire in 2015. As we said, it was something that needed to be continually re-signed into law, and it's set to expire. So what Obama does in 2014 is help write up the Freedom Act. In 2014, you had a Democrat majority in the Senate. Democrat majority in the Senate. And this is the best time for them to wind back the Patriot Act. This is their one chance, because in 2015, they're going to lose that majority. So in 2014, the Democrats under Obama have a majority in the Senate, and they have a chance to change, to wind back the Patriot Act. In 2015, it's going to be a Republican majority in the Senate, and it's the Republicans that brought in the Patriot Act. So they need, if they're going to wind back the Patriot Act and protect civil liberties, it needs to be done in 2014. So in 2014, Obama and the Democrats put together the USA Freedom Act. This was meant to replace the Patriot Act. This act would have put an end to the government's bulk collection of data. Now they weren't allowed to collect everything into one database to be accessed later. It would have changed, it would have kept some aspects of the Patriot Act. It didn't get rid of it completely, but it did wind it back. So if anything was to happen in 2014 from the leadership, it would have been scaling back this breakdown of the Constitution. It wouldn't have been a step forward. This is the battle in 2014, not a battle over a further breakdown, but a battle to keep the one that was brought in at 9/11. The Democrats failed in 2014, I think by one vote. They couldn't get it passed. And in 2015, the Republicans forced them to rewrite the USA Freedom Act. It was rewritten, but it was passed in 2015. The Patriot Act does not exist today. It's gone. It ended in 2015. There is no Patriot Act. Now the United States is under the Freedom Act. And with some tweaking that occurred in 2015 so that both parties would pass it, it is essentially the same as the Patriot Act with a few more safeguards in place to protect civil liberties. In May 2015, the courts began to rule that the NSA programs happening in this history that were collecting people's information were illegal. So we don't see this attack on the Constitution in 2014, which would constitute a Sunday law. What is the Sunday law? It's an attack on the US Constitution. It's an attack on church and state. So when we say Sunday law, what we're saying is the breakdown of the Constitution, and that is something that happens over a process of time. So in 2014, we should see a step in this process of the Constitution, end of the Constitution in the United States. But just like the internal, it has to be successful in this history. The behavior of the leadership or of enemies cannot stop something that's been decided, placed by God as a waymark. There must be a Sunday law then in this history. To understand what that was, I want to take us back to the time of the end. Something else began happening in 1989. This is where we introduce a new person. This man is named Nigel Oakes. Nigel Oakes. And he is British. He's not American. He has a background in studying television production and human psychology. And in 1989, he established the Behavioural Dynamics Working Group in London. So what he began in 1989 was studying how human beings behave. And he's studying human behaviour with his background in television production and technology, and he's beginning this study with a purpose in mind, and that is how to manipulate human behaviour. That began in 1989. In 1990, he founds the Behavioural Dynamics Institute. It's one of the premier institutes in the world today for studying what they call strategic communication, which is really just public manipulation, how to manipulate people. According to its own account, it's the leading international centre for the research and development into studying persuasion and social influence, how to persuade people to think the way you want them to think. It's the only organisation in the world whose understanding of the psychology of persuasion has been used on a global scale. This is the Behavioural Dynamics Institute, BDI. What we're beginning to understand now is how information management is being abused and manipulated to manipulate people. In 1992, he says something very interesting. Nigel Oakes is speaking to a magazine, and he said that his institutes use the same techniques as Aristotle and Hitler. We appeal to people on an emotional level to get them to agree on a functional level. What he's saying is that he's using the same technique that Hitler used. He targets people's emotions to get them to change their behaviour, to make a difference on how they function. An example of how this is used was done quite well in the midterm election just a month or so ago. We see Donald Trump say that they are facing an immigrant invasion and that they all need to be very, very scared. And this use of emotion and fear regularly lies are what Donald Trump is using to change people's behaviour. In this case, to vote for him. Election campaigns have been corrupt for a long time, but this is a degree of development that we have not seen before. In 1993, Nigel Oakes sets up a company called SCL. SCL stands for Strategic Communication Laboratory. So this is the study of how to communicate with strategy, communicate to manipulate. It became known for conducting military disinformation campaigns, including work in social media and particularly in elections. They expanded into the defence. They began working in war zones in Afghanistan and Iraq to target young men who are coming up who are being radicalised, to try and get them to change their behaviour. So they particularly developed their mode of their practices in war zones. In 2005, they began to pick up major clients working for the Pentagon and the UK Ministry of Defence. And also in 2005, they hold an exhibit at an international showcase. There's this huge exhibit in England where all these different companies come together to show off what their military technology can do. And SCL attends and sets up their own exhibit. And what they're showing off is how the government can use them to manipulate the public. So this is their own exhibit. This is what they did. They set up this pretend situation to show how they work. It's always good when they show you how they work. You don't have to search, they just tell you. What they did was a scenario, just this kind of fake scenario that was set in London. In London, they're saying over the past 24 hours, 7 people have checked into hospitals with symptoms of smallpox. So what they're in this scenario that they're building to show how they work, they're saying, pretend, just imagine that in London there's about to be this outbreak of smallpox and tens of thousands of people are about to die. This infection is spreading. The government is facing a dilemma. If people leave their homes to go to hospitals or to flee London, it's going to spread this illness all over, this smallpox illness all over the country, and now hundreds of thousands of people will die. It needs people to stay home. So if they tell people there's this smallpox outbreak, it'll make it much worse. They can't tell their people. This is where SCL wants to now be used by the government. They're saying this is where we step in. And what we do is we take over the media. We take over the radio, the newspapers, every access of information. And what we tell people is that there's a cloud of poisonous gas coming on London and you have to stay home. If you don't stay home, if you go outside your doors, this gas will kill you. They call this influence operations. The problem with this is that this is how to lie on a grand scale. This is how to lie to your people to change their behaviour. And it's easy to paint a situation where it seems like a good thing, where this saves tens of thousands of lives. And this is what they say: we do good things, we help save lives because we can use lies in a good way to protect people. Lying can protect people. The problem is that they do this for money. So while they may try and suggest that they only do this in a good way, what they have done through history is not so selfless. The spokesperson for SCL, when questioned about this exhibit, said, "Isn't it worth telling a lie for 2 days to save millions of lives? Sometimes the means to an end has to be recognised, so the lie is worth it if it saves lives." But he also goes on to say that we want to make money out of this. And what SCL then began to do was work in developing countries in election campaigns. What he acknowledges in this article is that it is very difficult to run mass deception in a country where there is a free and open media. It's harder to take over the media when they're free, but when they're run by the government, then it's easier to deceive the people. So they began to be paid by foreign governments that were in countries that did not have a free media. These are dictatorships. Dictatorships particularly in Africa and South America, in developing countries. What they did through this history, extremely dodgy. It's believed that in some, for example, elections in Africa, they shared videos of people having their limbs cut off, dying, being murdered for not voting a certain way. So intimidation tactics to force them to vote for the candidate who was paying them the most money. pretty much, if you understand the idea of a mercenary for hire. They're mercenaries for hire, but they're in business suits in London and they're dealing with information. As we said, they had trouble working in countries that had a free media. In 2012, Obama wins that election and the Republicans lose. And the Republicans realize they've lost because they were not using social media and these internet platforms very well in that election. So in 2012, SCL enters the US market, comes out of Britain, and it enters the United States. But it's not working for the Democrats and Obama, it begins working for the Republicans. After that election, SCL found the American marketplace far more open to working with SCL. A couple of names that we need to know. One of those, probably more than any other, the name Alexander Nix. And if you watch the documentaries that are being shared, you will see him. You'll see him speak at a conference in 2016 describing how his company works. Alexander Nix worked for SCL, and when he enters the US marketplace, he begins a new company. In 2013, there's two other people that we need to recognize. Christopher Wiley and Steve Bannon. Christopher Wiley is a young computer scientist. He's one of those people that wasn't really trained. He was born brilliant. He trained himself in code and computer technology to where he was employed to work in those fields without a degree of training. He was just one of those people born with that kind of mind, those kinds of skills. And at a very young age, he was picked up to work in elections, particularly in Canada. And then he's picked up by SCL and begins to work for Alexander Nix, who is his boss. Steve Bannon is an American fellow who's quite interesting. We'll discuss him in a moment. Christopher Wiley, a computer data scientist. Steve Bannon is I'm not really sure where he originally began on his journey, but he's been involved in American politics for a very long time. You may have heard of Breitbart News. This is a news website in the United States that's far right, far right. You're going into neo-Nazi territory when you head into Breitbart News. And Steve Bannon was the principal man behind that news site for many years, he himself being far right. Ties to neo-Nazis, ties to some concerning beliefs and behaviour. And Steve Bannon has been trying to change the US politics for many years. He says that there are four main turning points in US history. The first one, the American Revolution. The second, the American Civil War. So if I list these, the four main turning points. This is what's behind his theology. The US Revolution. The US Civil War. World War II. and right now. He says that we're in the fourth turning point in US history, and with that I do find we agree on something. And he says that this fourth turning isn't a war like these, but this is an information war. Or what he calls a culture war. A war of culture. He's a man that said a few months ago he would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. He says that America will come out on the right side of this history, but only if we break down our trust in the media. He wants us to not trust the media, instead start trusting this Breitbart News, what is usually termed by themselves as alternative news sources. And there's more than Breitbart News. There's quite a number of these alternative news sources. He said Lenin, going back to the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin wanted to destroy the state, Tsarist Russia. He says, that's my goal too, to destroy the US state. He says, I want to bring everything crashing down and destroy all of today's political establishment. So Steve Bannon believes that the United States is in an information or a culture war, and that politics flows out of this culture war. So if you step backwards, it's from politics, it's about information and culture. And if you step back from culture, it becomes about the people and the information they're receiving. So after the Republicans lost the 2012 election, Alexander Nix meets, somewhat by coincidence apparently, meets Steve Bannon. And Alexander Nix sees pretty much just dollar signs, money, a contract. So Alexander Nix shows Steve Bannon what SCL has developed, how they work with media manipulation and public manipulation. Steve Bannon likes this idea very, very much. This is the perfect weapon he's been needing to fight an information war or a culture war. Another quote by Steve Bannon. He said there is a growing global revolt against political establishments and the political class and global elites that influence the political class. These so-called, these billionaires that are supposed to be behind the politics. He says this revolt impacts everyone from Texas to London in England. And he says that London and Texas, the southern state of America, are the two fronts in the current culture war. So that's interesting. He said it's not just particularly the southern states of the United States, it's also London, which is the reason that you don't only see all of this upheaval in the United States, you also see Britain leave the EU. That Brexit campaign was orchestrated by SCL and Steve Bannon just the same way they were working in the US election. Brexit and Donald Trump's election are connected through Steve Bannon and SCL and this campaign of public deception. Steve Bannon didn't have enough money to pay SCL, so what he did was fly these two men, Alexander Nix and Christopher Wiley, their researcher, to the United States to meet with a billionaire Republican, Robert Mercer. So these three take their ideas, show what they can do to a man with a lot of money, Robert Mercer. Robert Mercer made his money back in this history with computer science back in 1989, 1991. He is another person who is far right. heading towards neo-Nazi territory, with some very, very concerning sets of beliefs. They pitched the idea to him that they could bring in what was already done, which was in election campaigns in the United States, that they could target person on person. So they could target very small groups of people to vote a certain way. They could bring that was previously done into something that had not been done in an election campaign before. And that was to bring in this psychological manipulation using personal data. This way, they're no longer targeting you as a voter based on your beliefs, but targeting you based on your emotions that they already know based on the information you've put on the internet. Robert Mercer invested $15 million into this idea for Alexander Nix to create a new company out of SCL. And the company they created in 2013 is known as Cambridge Analytica. It's a fancy sounding name that means very little. They pretty much just wanted to sound posh, according to Christopher Wiley. So don't get tripped up if you don't get much meaning from the name. They're trying to sound a little bit fancy. Christopher Wiley became their director of research. Alexander Nix was the CEO and director of the company. CEO and face of the company. There was one other man who became the managing director, Mark Turnbull. So if they're going to use manipulation of the public based on information, what they need is your private information. So what they did is there was a scientist, a Moldovan scientist, working at the University of Cambridge. He developed a Facebook app that allowed him to collect the personal details of about 80 million people, 80 million US Americans. So if you're on Facebook or on social media, let's say I go to a page, let's say I go to a page that's about vegan food, and I can tick a box that says I like that page, and that becomes a data point. Now the government knows I'm vegan. And then I can tick another thing that says, I don't like spiders. It's such small pieces of personal information that is now being put out on social media as we've become more and more attached to the internet. And what they took was between 4,000 and 5,000 of those little points of data for each of those 80 million people. So forgetting that there's 80 million of them, if we consider just one, that one is me. I've put out 4,000 to 5,000 pieces of information about myself. Now this company goes into my Facebook account, into my social media, and they can use other things than just Facebook, other forms of media, and they take all of that information and they create a map of me. They know my name, they know where I live, they know the church I attend, they know I'm afraid of spiders, they know I'm vegan. But that's just about 5 or 6 points. They have 4,000 to 5,000. And then putting them through computer software, they then begin to create a map of my personality. This is the work that Christopher Wiley did for them. According to, I just want to quote a couple of these people, direct quotes from some of these people. Christopher Wiley said they could even access the private messages that you'd sent between friends. He said that this was the method used to achieve Steve Bannon's overall objective, a culture war. Christopher Wiley said, "This is an information war. Social media, the internet, or the World Wide Web, is the battlefield. You are the target. Your co-workers only see one side of you. Your family only sees one side of you. But when we put out so much onto the internet, it sees every side of us because we don't realize someone is watching." Cambridge Analytica boasted of having 4,000 to 5,000 data points, not on 80 million, but on 126 million Americans. Is 126 a prophetic number? Yes. So they took in all of this information, they created a personality profile that knew me better than apparently my own family, and now what they claim to be able to do is access my fears, my hopes, my emotions that I don't even know I have. That using all these points, they can know how to drive me emotionally. Mark Turnbull, the managing director of Cambridge Analytica, said the two main human drivers when it comes to accepting information are our hopes and our fears. And many of those we aren't aware that we have, and we don't speak of them. You didn't know you were afraid of something until you saw something that brought about fear in you. He said our job, the job of Cambridge Analytica, is to drop the bucket further down the well than anybody else, to tap into those emotions farther than anyone else can, to understand what those really deep-seated underlying fears and concerns are. He says, quote, "It is no good fighting an election campaign on the facts because actually it is all about emotion." The reason we know this information is Christopher Wiley is disconnected from American politics, but his young, pink-haired, homosexual, not conservative American Republican like Steve Bannon, Robert Mercer, those people. He's not right-leaning. So when he saw what was happening, he became a whistleblower. He started to speak out. He didn't realize when he was developing this software how it was going to be used. So he carries a lot of responsibility and guilt now that he really developed what he called Steve Bannon's culture war weapon, the new weapon. And people question why we should believe him when he's obviously opposed to these ideas. And I believe that we can believe him, first of all, because what I'm about to read to you, which are quotes directly from Alexander Nix and Mark Turnbull, who ran this company, but also because the things that he alleged are continually being proven true in courts and in investigations into Brexit and into the US election. He's consistently being proven to have spoken the truth. So Mark Turnbull says, "We do not fight an election on the facts." When this information started to leak out of what had happened, some news organisations, particularly a British one, conducted a private investigation. What they did was they pretended to be someone running a campaign in an African country, and this person undercover with wires approached Alexander Nix and Mark Turnbull and said, "We want you to work for us in this election in Africa." And then he went in with wires and taped what they told him and how they were willing to run his fake election campaign. So these quotes are on video that you can go online and watch them say. And I've just watched those videos and typed as they spoke. Alexander Nix says they're the largest and most significant political consultancy firm in the world. They have the best record for winning elections. And he says that we're used to working in the shadows. He continues to say, we do a lot more than that, than just research. He says that they know how to entrap your opponents. So if I'm running in an election against you, what Cambridge Analytica can do for me is trap you. They can go to you and offer you a bribe and video you taking it, or they can send women to your house and video it. So that's something they claim that they're also willing to do, is take down your political opponents by these methods, which again are illegal. Mark Turnbull says, in working in elections and putting out information against your opponent, so imagine this is Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. Mark Turnbull says it sounds like a terrible thing to say, but these are things that don't necessarily need to be true as long as they're believed. So Mark Turnbull, later you might imagine this is a company working for Donald Trump in the election process, is telling Donald Trump, you don't have to say the truth. As long as the people believe you, that's all that matters. Doesn't matter if it's a lie, they just need to believe you. Alexander Nix says the way they go into foreign countries, they set up fake IDs and websites. They go in as pretending to be students or doing research projects, pretending to be tourists. They work undercover and they make sure that what happens in that election cannot be tied back to them. So what they begin doing, 2012, this company enters the US market. 2013, we see Snowden speaking out against government surveillance. In 2014, Cambridge Analytica begins to harvest data information. So if we have a problem with the US government taking data under the Patriot Act, taking our private information to be used against generally criminals in courts of law, now in 2014 we have a whole new step. And this is Cambridge Analytica, and they're doing the exact same thing that the government was doing under the Patriot Act, but in a much larger scale. And now this is no longer to at least claim to protect you, to use these things in a court of law. Now they are using this data to influence how you vote, particularly how you vote, but also your mindset, how your worldview, how you see the world. 2014, they harvest this data from approximately 80 million Facebook profiles in the United States. And then they begin to develop computer software. What they start doing in 2014, now that they have these personality profiles of people, is put out ideas onto the internet. So in the background of the internet, these data researchers are saying little things like build the wall. Have you all heard Donald Trump say build the wall? It's in 2014 Cambridge Analytica starts saying build the wall into obscure parts of the internet, and then they see how much emotion, how much support they get for those sentiments. Drain the swamp, another phrase of Donald Trump. They start putting out in 2014 to see how people respond. Race realism. It's a strange sounding quote that really means the rolling back of civil rights. Also, they start putting out, they start investigating public opinion on Russia, how the people view Russia. This is all preparation for a presidential campaign. Christopher Wiley says we were testing all kinds of messages in 2014, all kinds of different images, so not just words but now images of people scaling walls, images of walls. He said they tested things like drain the swamp, ideas of a deep state. If you've heard of the idea of the deep state, it's that there's this state usually considered to be the opposition to these far-right Donald Trump see them as the opposition, generally Democrats, that are running the government behind the scenes in the shadows. These are all put out onto the internet. The ideas that the NSA is watching you and the government is conspiring against you, that it is taking down its own people. Conspiracy theories, all of these start to be investigated, not because they're true, but because they're trying to see how much of an emotional response and how they can manipulate people using these ideas. What Christopher Wiley said, that they began to find that there was pockets of American people, small groups of American people, that responded very well to these ideas. Steve Bannon was already well acquainted with Donald Trump. They've had similar leanings and prior dealings. And in 2016, Donald Trump hires Steve Bannon. So, if I can find that. One condition Robert Mercer had in giving $15 million to start this company was that this company was to be overseen by Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon was to direct what the company did with this information. Steve Bannon is a brilliant man. He's a dangerous man, but he's pretty brilliant. In December of 2016, so this is after Donald Trump has won the election, he's speaking at a rally, a thank you rally for the people that voted for him. And he's talking about the phrase "drain the swamp." He says it's funny how that term has caught on. He says, "I hated it. Somebody said to me, go out and say, drain the swamp. I said, that's so hokey, that's so ridiculous, it's a terrible phrase. But I said, all right, I'll just try it." So he says, a month later, I went out at a rally and I said, drain the swamp, and the place went crazy. People gave an emotional response. I said, wow, what is this? Then I said it again. Then I started saying it like I meant it. Did he mean it before? No, he just liked the emotional response. And then he backs down and says, it's true, I love it, but the place loved it. So what he just acknowledged, not only in interestingly telling us that he had to learn to say these things like he meant them in the first place, he also acknowledges that someone in the shadows told him to say these phrases. Who told him? Cambridge Analytica, because they'd already done all that testing in 2014 and they knew what they needed to do to manipulate the public, just like they showed us they were trying to do in 2005, mass public deception. Not only creating fear that there is a swamp to begin with, not saying US politics was clean before that, it's started to fall years and years before, but creating this emotional response and suggesting that Donald Trump is then going to fix that problem. Christopher Wiley said, I was surprised when I saw the Donald Trump campaign and when it started saying things like building walls or draining the swamp, and I'm remembering in my head, wait, we tested all of this in 2014. Alexander Nix, speaking of Donald Trump's campaign, Alexander Nix, the CEO of the company, says that we did all the research, the data, the analytics, all the voter targeting. We ran all the digital campaign, the television campaign, and our data is what decided all of that election strategy. Christopher Wiley says this was the weapon that Steve Bannon needed to fight his culture or information war. That war occurring in 2016. So what you see in 2014 is not only a massive violation of constitutional rights, but also the development of a weapon that was used in the election of 2016. And it was based on information. I'm hoping that we can provide access to some of those videos for those of you that don't have it to see from in their own words what happened at that time period. But they're used to working in the shadows. So SCL formed Cambridge Analytica, but they also formed another company, Aggregate IQ. And it's Aggregate IQ that worked in the Brexit campaign in England. Both come from SCL. But they're good at trying to hide it, and it has been difficult to prove that it ties back to SCL, but you can demonstrate that. So if we consider the war in heaven, what did Satan do to the angels? He deceived them. It's the exact same what they're admitting to in 2005 at this, when they try and showcase what they can do, what they try and paint in a good light, is mass public deception. This is the same strategy that Satan used in heaven. Mass deception of the angels. And it always contains some bit of truth. They're able to say, you know what, Obama made a lot of terrible decisions. And the United States does have problems. And the economy does have problems. They can say all that. The deception isn't necessarily all lies. That is then manipulated, and it's particularly used against emotion. So what does this war look like? Is it ones with arrows and sieges and falling infrastructure? The universe's first war was a war of deception and a war of the mind, and that is what we saw happen in 2016. What we're talking about is not new, and we also see that in the Garden of Eden. Eve fell because she accepted faulty, manipulative information that was part truth and part lie. And why did Adam fall? Was he deceived? Emotion, pure emotion. So you put those two together, the deception and the emotion, and that was the first where sin entered and the war began on earth. We have to identify what happened in our prior history if we're going to understand what happens in our future history. So to understand what happens at Raphia, we need to understand what happened in 2016 in that first battle. And to understand that first battle, we need to understand the mode of warfare, the weapon that was really developed in 2014. This idea of alternative news, it's what is necessary to bring in a dictator. You can't have a free and open media in a dictatorship. Putin's goal for many years has been to convince people, both inside his own country and outside, that there is no difference between Russia and the West. This way his own people don't think that there's something better to hope for. So the tale he spins is that there is no difference to the United States invading Iraq than to Russia invading the Ukraine. No difference between his state-run media and the United States state-run media, what we would consider their normal media. News sites, they're not infallible. They have faults and weaknesses and biases. We can see that. But this is talking about something different. And we understand that when the media falls, when they start, when Robert Mueller is finally taken down and this investigation into Russia is ended, when all of those things that are putting a stop to Donald Trump, and one of those is the media, when they're taken aside, that's when you know you have a dictator. We're really tempted to look into the future, 2020, 2021, and we want to know what's happening in that future history. But I would suggest that we really need to make sure that we have the past straightened out, that we understand what happened in 2014, 15, and 16. There's people in the movement, our own brothers and sisters, who didn't realize, and perhaps we ourselves, that didn't realize that we were using information sources that were using this kind of thinking. People sharing news sources from Breitbart News, not realizing this is the mouthpiece for Steve Bannon, who's directing Cambridge Analytica, who already knows how to conduct public deception. And the lies in that 2016 campaign. Politicians, they don't get to the position they're in by telling the truth. Obama didn't become president by just telling the truth. There's a degree of corruption at every level. But what we see now is something truly different. The ultimate development. In the 2012 election campaign, Obama used social media. He used Facebook. But he never extracted data without approval of the people. First of all, if you wanted Obama to extract your data, first of all, you needed to be on their database, which means you gave out your information voluntarily. They didn't then go in and access the information of your friends. They didn't then put that through algorithms and target you on this information level. He's using it to a degree, but that weapon isn't truly developed and fired till 2014 and 2016. We have a few minutes left. If you don't mind, I'll rub this out. We can see that this new mode of, how we understand 2015 can be illustrated from the internal. Comes out of Britain, enters the USA in 2012. It's opposed by the work of enemies who are trying to restrict, really it's whatever Snowden did, whether he's a traitor or not, it's in defense of the Constitution. Cambridge Analytica begins in 2013, but there's internal enemies and external enemies in the government of the United States. 2014, they begin their data, gathering their data, building this weapon and those computer algorithms. Much of this is done in the shadows. 2015, you see Donald Trump declare that he's running for US government. But what becomes his election campaign, the development of that happens previously. Just a few moments, I want us to consider this new mode of warfare. What do we mean when we say an information war? Yes, a war over technology. We understand that November 9, 2019 is our test. So we need to understand what that looks like so we can be ready for it. We need to be able to prepare for that. We're going to deal with that prophetically, not on a moral level, not that we pass it morally, but that we pass it prophetically. That's the only way that we can teach this. When we review the lines of Pyrrhus and World War II, those Alpha and Omega histories, we see a few interesting things we can learn. First of all, when did Pyrrhus fight Demetrius? They never fought. They didn't fight, they fought as allies at Ipsus, but they didn't fight each other. They never fought with that invasion. They never fought with that invasion. And when Demetrius is defeated, it's internal. His own people turn against him, they never fight. You see battles illustrated in the line of Italy, but we understand that that mode of warfare was the same one that occurred up here at Ipsus, which takes us to 2016. And then World War II gives us the idea of two fronts in a war, not four distinct battles, but these two fronts. So how then do we understand, how can we put that all together to give us more of an idea of what this war looks like? When we consider the counterfeit, we understood those 46 years. That can take us internally 1798 to October 22, 1844. This is a 46 year history. And that Ellen White says this is a history of the first and the second angel's message. And then the third runs through history until it's empowered. And when we look at the counterfeit, 1899, the raising up of Pacelli, you have the history of World War I, World War II, taking you to the disappointment of 1945. You can see the Third World War. What is the Third World War? USA versus Soviet Union. What is usually termed the Cold War. And what happened? The Cold War refers to the period between the end of World War II and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. This was when the world was divided into those two camps of the United States-led West and the Soviet Union-dominated East, democracy and communism. But it never became hot. This Cold War really began at the end of 1945 when the Iron Curtain came down and they saw Stalin set up puppet governments in Eastern Europe. The alliance between the United States, Britain and the USSR, those three allies, broke down when the atomic bomb was used in Japan in 1945. In 1946, Churchill said that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. In 1947, the relationship ends entirely in what is known as the deep freeze, a total freeze of interaction between the East and the West that lasts until Stalin dies in 1953. Then we discussed how NATO was formed and Comecon, the two alliances that opposed each other. This they described as a dynamic struggle. At the close of World War II, the Soviet Union stood firmly entrenched in Eastern Europe, intent upon installing governments there that would pay allegiance to the Soviet Union, to the government of the Soviet Union. And then it tried to expand into North Korea, Central Asia and the Middle East. At the same time, the United States was attempting to expand in Western Europe, Latin America, Asia, Australia. They're also forming their own union. A Cold War is a state of conflict. It is a war between nations that does not involve a direct military action, but it's pursued through economic and political action. It's through propaganda, which is information, acts of espionage or proxy wars. By 1960, both sides, East and West, had developed nuclear weapons. And what the term that was then used to describe the state of war was MAD. M-A-D, it's an acronym. M-A-D. It stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. And this began when both sides developed nuclear weapons. If the United States was to fire against the Soviet Union would fire against the United States, and then you've just destroyed both countries, if not the world itself. Has that dynamic changed? Is there still mutually assured destruction? Yes. Yes, if that same dynamic had never ended at the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union still has nuclear weapons, the United States still has nuclear weapons, and both fingers are still on the trigger. That never ended. We've just forgotten about it. We've got complacent. But now there's another dynamic. Now there is mutually assured economic destruction. When the Soviet Union collapsed, hundreds of billions of dollars hemorrhaged out of the Soviet Union into the West. Now, if the US economy falls, so does the economy of much of the world, including that of Russia. Russia is now part of a global economy. All of these issues about territory and strategy are going to play out very differently than they did even in the time of the Cold War. Back then, the Soviet Union was isolated. Now they're not isolated. Vladimir Putin has an estimated net worth of between $200 to $500 billion. We say Donald Trump is rich. He's not as rich as Vladimir Putin. This isn't his country's economy. This is his personal wealth. And where is that personal wealth held? It's not held in Russia, it's held in the West. When oligarchs, those Russian billionaires, flee Vladimir Putin, where do they go? They nearly all go to London, because it's through London that many of those Russian rich men hold their money. That's why you continually see, we don't see it nearly as often as it happens, that those men start dying in strange ways. When they run away from Putin and they run to Russia, you start seeing Russians die in very strange ways on the streets of London, whether or not they're poisoned, whether or not they somehow fall out of tiny windows or they stab themselves. There's strange ways that those people start dying, and that's the work of Vladimir Putin. But the reason those deaths are in London is that's because that's where they run to, that's where they hold their money. But his $200 to $500 billion is held in the West. We're going to look into that. I want to finish that thought a little bit more when we come together tonight. But just to give some idea of the strength of the United States. In 2016, this is under Obama, this is when Donald Trump is saying we're weak, we need to rebuild our military, our borders are weak, our country is weak. Under Obama, who didn't really do that, is claimed to have not done that good a job with the US military. In 2016, the US defense spending was $611 billion. This is how much of the US economy, US government spending went into just their military and defense. The Russian defense spending in 2016, that's the US, the Russian, was $69.2 billion. Approximately about 1/9 of the United States. Russia cannot compete in a hot war against the United States, partly because it would be mutually assured destruction, even if they were as strong, partly because they are now part of a global economy, and also because you can't keep up with that kind of defense spending. I want to discuss when we come back a little bit more of Vladimir Putin and Russia, and that money and the problems that he's facing in the West, the problems that Putin is facing with holding that money in the West and what the United States has over him. We'll discuss that when we come back together. If you would mind kneeling with me in prayer. Father in heaven, Lord, thank you for all of our blessings. Thank you, Lord, for opening up history to us. Father, it feels strange to look into recent history. For years now, you've opened up battles of Raphia and Padium and fights between in the Greek Empire, wars in the Roman Empire. But Lord, there's a war much closer to us that we need to understand. I pray, Lord, that just like we strive to understand those wars in history between Seleucus and Ptolemy, those wars in history in ancient Rome, that we will have an understanding of the war we now face. May we be willing to put aside our preconceived ideas, and I pray you will strengthen us in mind to put aside our alliances to parties, to ideology, Lord, and take all of that to align. Father, we understand that our governments are corrupt, that we are not to be involved in politics in that way, Lord, that there is corruption at every level. But Lord, you teach us these things for a reason to open up the future. And I pray, Lord, that we will be prepared for what is coming, and that we will not be shaken by what we see or what we hear. I pray, Lord, that we will be strengthened in our emotions. Father, that those emotions are not just the ones that are generally thought of, but Lord, the lifting up of self, the emotion of pride, the desire to be first, all of those things are emotions, Lord, that they will be put at the foot of the cross, and that we will be willing servants for you, Lord, to do this work of reaching the world. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.